Hello and welcome to a very strange episode of the ASD podcast. After a very brief coronavirus sponsored hiatus, we're back with a episode tentatively titled Staying Sane with Daniel and David. And my co-host today is Dr. Daniel Driver, who any podcast viewer / listener is very familiar with. And anytime that Daniel is on, Twitter is on fire. Now, there's a difference between Twitter on fire and Twitter on theological fire. Twitter on theological fire means if you get two comments saying, boy, Daniel was great. So Twitter was on theological fire anytime Daniel has come on. So thank you for joining me today, Daniel.
David, it's nice to see you. How are you keeping?
Good. You know, I think this period, what I'm finding is for every 10 days, I have one day where I go, oh no, this is going to go on for another year. This is not good. Oh no, what's going to happen? And the other 9 days are perfectly fine. What about you? Are you finding sanity easy, or is sanity a struggle?
Yeah, it's a struggle. My cycle's a little shorter than yours, I think.
Right.
I don't know about the 10 days. It kind of makes sense. It's funny how that goes. So my wife is a superstar and has been running a pretty tight ship around here, setting kind of a schedule that we all keep to. My one contribution is that when we're doing school at home, we can't have any pajama days. That was the appeal
Right.
right at the beginning, is that every day is a jammy day. And I said, no, we're all going to get up and we're all going to get dressed and we're going to have breakfast and we're going to do the day as if it's a regular day,
Right.
since it's all on top of it, on
Yeah.
top of itself. But Adriel had set out this incredible series of, she was trying to do Easter in place, basically. And so lots of activities up towards that. And I chipped in as best I could, but really she set the agenda. And we both crashed on Sunday. So that kind of fit a 10-day cycle, right?
Right.
The run up through Holy Week to Easter. And we both crashed because it was in some ways so disappointing. I mean, it just,
Right.
and I think the kids had a pretty good experience, but we were trying to recreate something that just, wasn't happening.
Yeah, and
So
that's a
at least
tension.
every 10 days.
Yeah,
At least
that's a
every 10
tension
days.
between. So on the one hand, I've written a blog post for the girls' school, in which I spoke about the martial imagery that leaders are using, and suggesting that while it's good for us to think about this as an enemy because it helps us to stay the blazes home, there are some enemies that you don't necessarily face head on, like for example a bull. You know, you butt heads with a bull, it's not a good idea. Instead, you have to kind of sway with it and dance with it. And part of me thinks that not trying to force this time into the categories of normal time is the best thing to do. And so to embrace the weirdness of it, to embrace the strange opportunity. So an example of this would be, instead of feeling frustrated that my kids are simply not going to learn as much of the curriculum as they would at school, it's not going to happen, to look to embrace alternative learning opportunities. So, for example, they can have a chat with an elderly relative, which will help an elderly relative in their isolation, but it will also can also give them a kind of a first-person history lesson. You know, so
Yeah.
while their math might be going down a little bit, maybe they can learn more about history. They can learn more about the past or various things. But at the same time, I'm 100% with you in that if there's one thing which helps me, it's staying busy. That's absolutely crucial, and getting wins. And so what I mean by that is that in day-to-day life, you've got constant projects, you've got constant little things, and every time you do them, or you get a project done, or you get inbox cleared out, or you teach a good class, or you see a student's paper and you go, yes, they got it. You get a little endorphin hit, and it's vital in this time that we maintain those dopamine highs, that we get from good stuff, that we get from success. And so I'm torn. On the one hand, I'm absolutely committed, stay busy, keep structure, all that stuff, stay productive, but at the same time, without trying to force this time into the framework of normal time, because it won't go, and it will just end up frustrating us, and meaning that we will be dictators towards the kids, whose natural rhythms, they're naturally a kind of staying up later. No matter what time they go to bed at, they're not getting to sleep at the same time, because they're not getting as much exercise during the day. And and so I think we need to recalibrate a wee bit, while at the same time staying productive.
I think so. I think that I'm not sure about being productive. I mean, there's this sort of thing where there must be a couple of phases to this response. We're now entering month 2.
Right.
We've basically been sheltered in place for 4 straight weeks.
Wow.
We had March break and then 3 weeks of homeschooling. Is that about what you guys are at too?
Yeah.
And in a certain sense, I think the first response was like, do stuff. It's pretty concrete. It was about making sure that you're provisioned to, I don't know, wipe all the bottoms that need wiping and that sort of thing. So that you have food and, the basics. And then with that, I mean, you and I are both in a place where we're, education has been able to make a pivot to teaching online, and we're well set up to do that at AST because we teach a fair bit of online courses. And yet there was still a big push. And in a certain sense, it was just like doing things all the time. And we're now entering a phase where we have to figure out what normal is. And I think there's some grief that's finally happening about all the things. At least, I don't know if the girls remember this, but they were in plays. My oldest 2 had parts in plays, and they had, in the first weeks they were still rehearsing that, and now they've stopped rehearsing their parts. Yeah. And, so there's all these things that, whether it's March Madness or Wimbledon or your kids' play or whatever it is, all these things that people look forward to and pour their energies and lives into, there's a new kind of phase that we're entering into, which is like, well, that's done for now. So I don't know that productivity is the right kind of thing for that. It's kind of an emotional sloshing about. And, on the second and third passes through this, there's in some ways less to do. And I don't know that anybody's having these moments of Zen where they kind of sit with their own quiet selves and reflect on the new reality. But there's an increasing level of, I think, I don't know, a certain kind of sadness. I think that's what happened to me on Easter Sunday, is that we got to, and some of it was like the Christmas morning kind of stuff where you get out the candy and you set up all the things and you kind of eat and a crazy thing, and the kids get up early and the parents went to bed late, and so we're all feeling sort of wrecked anyway. But there was a deeper sadness, which was about the fact that wasn't actually Easter Sunday in any form that I recognized. Or it was, but it was the strangest way to celebrate it that I've ever experienced.
Have you been doing online church, and how's that been going if you have?
I suppose I could pull up the email. I haven't. That's the short answer. Not really.
Right.
The church youth group has been doing a fairly good job. They've been doing Zoom meetings, and there have been art activities that go with that, and that has worked because there's something physical that everybody's doing. So, for example, on Palm Sunday, everybody had an art project that they were drawing, and then different kids read sort of lections to each other. That worked great. Parents were involved. That was the best church experience that I've had. Our church has been pre-recording things, and I've clicked into some of the videos, and I just can't watch it. It just doesn't feel, sorry, people at church who are doing the work on this. It just doesn't work for me. For whatever reason, I can't put on my headphones and hold up my phone or whatever and watch that and feel like I'm participating in church. So there's a yes and no, but mostly for me personally, no. Uh,
Right.
unless there's like a connected activity, and I feel like that's sort of the yeah. Actually, in fact, um, we had such an explosion of screen time in our house that on Good Friday, I kind of suggested and then mandated that everybody take all of our devices, and we locked them away and didn't take them out. Not because they're going to save us like Jesus on Easter Sunday and come back from the dead, but I just needed some quiet. I just needed to
Right. Yeah.
not go to services or attempt to do anything else
Yeah.
in the you know over that period.
Yeah. Yeah. It is unquestionably a strange thing. So religious services online certainly do some good things, but the good things also begin to undermine some of the things that I'm looking for. So the Tridium, for example, on Thursday evening, we had at one stage 3,000 people on St. Mary's Basilica Holy Thursday Mass, and it was exhilarating at times because so first up Oria Sodi introduced it brilliantly, and it was just so great to see her. So Oria, yay. And then Bishop is there, Deacon so and so is there, and it's and it's all cool. But then also everybody in the chat box on side starts chatting, and because they're so isolated, they're so desperate of interaction with people that they don't see. And so throughout the entire mass, it was this nonstop stream of commentary. It was a kind of like what you'd expect at an evangelical service on the deep south. The people were typing amen and praise, and then chatting with one another and shouting out various things. And it was just really really unsettling, but also positive in other ways. And also the Pope has done some things which I think were very powerful. So I think that there is a space for certain forms of ritual and certain forms of religious expression which work really well at this time in the online format. And Pope Francis has been just hitting it out of the park every time. There was that one time where he's in St. Peter's by himself, and the production was just off the charts. Like, they had a camera like 300-400 feet above him to capture that sense. Like, it was, I don't know whether they got Spielberg involved or whoever, but someone had a real sense of how to create this sense of isolation, vastness, and yet like a candle in a big space, keeping the flame lit. It was very powerful and very well done. So I think there are again, I think just like with our kids' educational schedule, if we try and simply recreate normal time, we'll end up with a pretty piss poor version of normalcy. Whereas if we say, okay, this is a different thing, what might work in this space, we might be able to come up with some more novel things that work. And liturgically, I think we're seeing that. But it has been a benefit to me, at least, being able to participate. Although I did go because Eastlink had it on channel 610 or whatever, and that with that you don't get the chat. So I went on the chat to do the social thing at the start, and then went onto the TV, so be distracted by the by the chatter for the majority of it. Um, but I think it's, again, this is a weird and wonderful opportunity to ask ourselves, how can we do it differently? Instead of simply trying to recreate a liturgical service which is predicated upon sensory experience, smells, touch, a whole host of things, what ought it look like in this other space? And I think some church groups are missing a trick by not being more experimental at this time. And what we do and produce in this time, we might be able to take forward, in the future, and do online church in better ways,
Yeah, I mean, what's your mileage may vary sort of thing, but for me
Yeah.
personally, that asynchronous pre-recorded church service where I watch the priests in my church sort of run through the liturgy, it just didn't work. Maybe I needed that chat bar on the side, but I
Right.
think other people have found it to be pretty good. I mean, from what I hear, it's been getting good sort of watches. We got click throughs now,
Yeah.
and so for certain people, it's really working. I think for me, partly the dynamic was going from lots of screens all day, every day, and then trying to just bring one more screen into the picture for a church experience, and that didn't
Yeah.
work for
Good point.
me, but for
What's
others.
it?
So yeah,
No, you
go on.
please.
I was going to say a couple of other things about this. One is we did have a home group that met fortnightly, and we moved to a Zoom meeting on Thursday nights, and we started doing it every week. And that's been a pretty important connection. I also know from that there are people in that group who are in streamed and pre-recorded sort of church settings that are working from them. So I realize that some of this is idiosyncratic to me. I think that's a good point, that there's an opportunity. But I also hear, maybe I'm just like, I want to be on the same thing. And I've been on this in some of our chats at work, but I also spoke to a young priest's sister in Toronto who did his Good Friday service on a live stream that got Zoom bombed with some lurid and gross content, and it wrecked the
Oh,
service.
terrible. Yeah.
So there's all these things that are happening
Yeah.
that we get waylaid in ways that are sometimes pretty obvious.
That is rough. Crystal ball, looking into the future. What will this do, in your opinion, to the church, to church attendance? So, for example, a sociologist of religion who I respect a lot thinks that this will be devastating by virtue of the fact that once you break a habit, it's hard to get back into the habit. And the people who were attending church habitually are now getting a license not to attend church habitually, and without solid reason to recreate that habit, they'll go. Do you fear that, or do you have any thoughts about whether that will happen or not? What will this do to church attendance after this is all over?
No idea. It could go either way. I mean,
Yeah,
I've heard from neighbors who aren't particularly church going, who have seen sort of Adriel's efforts in the last week,
yeah,
and they respond really positively. It seems like
yeah,
there's a desire for that,
yeah,
and there might be a sense where people say, my partner kind of wants to go to church and I kind of don't, but maybe we'll give it a try when we can. Maybe
yeah,
that will be a way that people will
yeah,
reconnect, or not. Who knows?
yeah.
When I ask, I just don't know.
Yeah, I think my hunch is that it will actually be, we'll see larger numbers at church afterwards, particularly in
For
the
a
short
short
term.
time, yeah.
For a short time, yeah. Many traditional things get a massive boost after periods of crisis. So if you think of, cricket and baseball after the Second World War, if you think of church after the Second World War, there's a massive, massive, massive spike. The one thing I would worry about, though, long term, and I still think it's going to actually be good. I think we will have an upswing. But the one thing that I do worry about is, and we've discussed this a little bit, is the Rusty Reno fear
But
that.
so let's explain that. What's the Rusty Reno thing?
So First Things has gotten itself in. First Things, the theological magazine, not the political/theological magazine of a fairly conservative bent, has gotten itself into significant trouble by questioning the narrative surrounding lockdown and isolation. And it's gotten itself into trouble because these are radically iconoclastic ideas. These are ideas outside of the norm, because we're all 100% on board for social distancing, isolation, all the rest of it. But a number of First Things authors, including its editor-in-chief, Rusty Reno, have suggested that the rationale for the isolation is problematic by virtue of the fact that it enforces the idea that that which is of ultimate significance is bodily health, and indeed life, understood as the prolonging of an organism rather than life in the spirit, etc. And for a Christian, we need to see the ultimate good is union with the triune life, which certainly isn't localized in heaven or the afterlife, but which incorporates that as well as union with the triune God in this. And so churches downing tools to the extent that churches have, and people in general saying, turning plaintively to whatever this thing called science is. I'm not sure what it is, but whatever it is, turn to science and say, we trust in you, O great science, save us from this time of trial. And that is a further nail in the coffin of Christianity and of religion in general. We see Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio being done up as a healthcare professional, and this, I think, exemplifies the kind of thing that Reno was getting at, that right now we're acting as if doctors and something called science are our saviors, whereas even if they can, which they can't ultimately, but even if they could save our lives, that isn't salvation, And so the triumph of technology, the triumph of the material as the only real, is being established in a very, very robust fashion at this time, when we say all that matters is to keep this ticker beating, and the ones who can help do this are our magisterium. They're Robert Strang, they're MacNeil, they're secular politics, and this thing we call science. We don't know what it is. So this is what First Things have been saying in various ways through various authors, and suggesting it's a problem for the long-term health of both the world but also the church.
I mean, yeah, let me share. There was a nice sort of response to this. This is on Alan Jacobs's blog, blog.aj.org. This is a while ago. I'd sort of forgotten about that thread for a while. Did you see this?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yeah, this sort of idea, it's, as he puts it, it's just sort of astonishing that you have this can I say these things online? Post-Heideggerian, or quasi-Foucauldian continental philosopher and a traditionalist Catholic making exactly the same argument about bare life. I think Jacobs is the one who said, look, Reno basically took a plausible thesis and took it to its absurd conclusion, and followed it up with a post that said, why death is bad, a primer for Christians, as if we needed to review some of the most basic things. So I thought that was... I wasn't sure that I totally followed that response, but I thought, there was something that miscarried in that fundamentally. And I checked in for a little while to see what Reno was doing. He's in New York, right? So in kind of the biggest epicenter at the moment. And for a while, in late March, I was still watching him post his coronavirus diaries, his reports that he would file, and I thought, I just can't follow this anymore. That was an age ago. I don't remember where... I don't know how that's wound up, but
time has certainly slowed down. But I think so. Yeah, after you.
No, there was another response to that which seemed kind of useful to me. I mean, Reno, I don't get. Somebody needs to explain his position to me, because he was a Trump booster, and then a kind of a social distancing skeptic. And I don't know how he does that. In a certain way, I feel like he's giving a lie to a certain generation's really bad response to the current circumstances very broadly, and then most specifically this coronavirus time, whatever the heck. However those things dovetail. But maybe I'm being too dismissive there.
No, I think so. if now again, I think that so a friend of mine is not really a friend of mine. I know him through Twitter and things like that. But he's starting up essentially an Irish magazine, which would be a little bit similar to First Things. And he was asking me the other day, what would I like to see in it? And I was saying that more than anything, we need iconoclasm. Like, I think so 90% of all the takes that we have in Spiked, for example, are both wrong and odious, and I'm grateful for them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm grateful for outliers making a pitch to challenge or like the dominant perspective. And so from that stance, I like what Reno does. Do I agree with him on his toleration of Trump for pragmatic reasons? Absolutely not. But I like that he is a non-stupid proponent of things that I find odious. I don't think that he was, as everyone suggested he was, poo-pooing social distancing. He was certainly calling into question the rationale and the logic that fuels social distancing, and you can call into question that logic without calling into question the practice. Death, of course, is a bad thing, but from the Christian perspective, it is also more than simply a bad thing.
Yeah,
it is
that's right.
it is
That's
it
right.
is other things simultaneously. Now, our boy Agamben, I think, might actually in time be seen as one of the important prophets of this period.
Hmm.
The
So
the fact
give me 3 sentences on that.
so the fact is, so Agamben's basic stance is to question the way the state assumes all authority and subtly annihilates individual freedoms in very distinctive ways. And at this time, obviously, this is heightened by virtue of the fact that, um, as I tweeted and then deleted soon after, fear makes fascists of us all. you know, so again, people on social media, people of the Twitter generation, what is a fascist? A fascist is someone who is bad. A fascist is someone who is a racist. A fascist is someone who's all these things. And that all might be true as well, but a fascist is someone for whom what matters is the collective, which is embodied most perfectly in the state, and that all individual freedoms, all individual personhood should be subordinated to the fundamental collective, which is embodied primarily in the state and should work towards that end. And so we have the fascis, this bundle of sticks, this old Roman symbol of a bundle of sticks tied together, and then you can't break them. And so we think of the I don't want to say the great Italian fascists, but people like Gentile, the philosophers, the neo-Hegelian philosophers, which articulated the logic that came to be expressed politically as what we know as fascism. Now we're seeing that now, in a sense. We're seeing that everybody just wants the state to save us. All political leaders, even Trump's hatred level has gone down a little bit. Boris Johnson's popularity is up. Trudeau's, every single leader is up, because we don't care. We just want our daddies to save us, and we will give up all freedoms and everything to that. We will have no problem in saying that person X or Y, for walking in a park, should be fined. I agree with this, but I need to be aware of what I'm saying.
I don't agree with that. I don't
Do you
agree with
not?
that. The state has overreached in shutting down the parks in Nova Scotia.
Yes, yeah.
To a degree that not that. So we went to some parks early on, and they were crowded, and that had to be dealt with. There were authorities who were asking people to disperse and the authorities weren't being heeded, that's a problem. But there are many natural walking paths that have been sealed off, which are very low risk, and the costs to people's mental health of keeping them more and more indoors when there's space where we happen to be for people to walk outside. There are probably places that are too popular to be open, and then there's this displacement thing. But we need to figure out how to. Yeah, I think that the state has already begun to slightly overreach in. Maybe I'm stating that wrongly, but I disagree about the shutting down parks thing.
Yeah, and I think there's a strong argument to be made, but I think what it really where the rubber meets the road in that is that we are saying that if the majority hold to a position, the state can enforce that coercively at the cost of those who disagree. So, for example, we have video footage of police, like SWAT teams, breaking down apartment doors because they heard loud music playing and voices and assumed there might have been a party going on inside, and breaking down these doors and going in ready to roll, with whatever the indoor equivalent of a water cannon is. Now, if that was, for example, a party during Nazi Germany where the party was playing decadent music, or if that was a party in Soviet Russia where they were playing the Beatles or some other Western decadent music or so on and so forth, we would be just absolutely abhorrent. This would be our dystopian nightmare. But because we agree with the reason that, or many of us agree with the reason in general that the police are breaking down those doors, we support this level of police state. So Agamben is terrified by the inherent fascism, which this has revealed. Now, when again, Sartre once said that if everyone is fascist, then fascism is true. But a time will come, a few months down the line, I think, maybe a couple of years down the line, when all the things we take now to be absolutely unquestionable will be questioned. So for example, there are a number of leading scientists. They are a significant minority, but there are a number of leading scientists for whom we need to quarantine and isolate the vulnerable while keeping schools open to let the virus spread among largely safe populations to build up herd immunity, because in their modeling, that will ultimately lead to less deaths in the long term than keeping the virus alive over the course of a year and a half, or longer, God forbid, if there's no vaccine, and it ultimately will take out every care home over time, So our absolute unconditioned truth with closed doors, we don't care. Papa Strang, save us. Papa MacNeil, save us. Papa Trudeau, Papa Trump, whoever, save us. That this is a fundamentally dangerous thing. And it might be difficult for us to go back.
Yeah, that's true. That's so. You asked me a couple of weeks ago. We had a nice little run of podcasts, 8, 10, 12 weeks ago. I forget what it was. And you asked me about the American response to this. And I don't think we aired that bit, but it's the kind of cowboy response, right? And yet even Americans for the last 150 or 200 years in wartime or in other crises will say, look, I can't do for myself right now. So the response has been to look to the government. And there's been an incredible willingness in societies that prize individual liberty to surrender civil liberties to the state for these purposes, and how one comes back from that when there are bad actors and opportunists in those political systems, when already there's reasons to be concerned about the kinds of liberties that states are sort of taking to themselves to track people's cell phones and to kind of take this stuff. Will they give it back? And how does one protect and cultivate civil liberty in a time like this, and see that actually preserved, ideally strengthened in some way after this? That's a source of concern. Do you? Yeah, it's funny to be talking about this because I've actually kind of let it rest for a week or two because I got pundit fatigue. Do you think? Do you think our viewers and listeners will have pundit fatigue and will wonder what this sort of secondary warmed over punditry is from you and me?
Possibly, but yeah, I think every single time I listen to a podcast, my hope is starting out that there's no COVID-19 chat. I don't want to hear it. I want to hear something else. And that hope is always in vain. And I do find myself interested
Yeah, no, that's
in
right.
in the like in the ponderings, because it is like in terms of my life, this is probably the most interesting thing that's happened.
It's
It's
done several things.
so
So
fascinating.
there's like good and bad, and who knows how to connect them together and see what the net outcome will be. What will happen to church attendance? What will happen to civil liberties? I don't know. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that there has been an obvious uptick of interest in the local. Your local house has got way too much attention on it right now. But local politics, local health authorities, in a way that just wasn't interesting
Yeah.
5 or 6 weeks ago, is now all that we're looking at. I mean, we now know the names of our local health officials. I didn't know who Dr. Strang was before February of this year, and now we all sort of know what he says day to day in this province, and that's true elsewhere. So on the whole, that's not a bad thing. So let me try to put a bow on the Reno thing if I can. So the thing that seems right about that, to say, if the basic thing to say is like death is not the worst bad thing in a Christian view, and that there's this kind of extending of life without any kind of obvious rationale, and that's a logic that is sort of biting us in other ways. That seems true enough, and especially, what are we? This is Tuesday after Easter. There is so if the logic is individuals do for themselves as best they can, and when they can't, they look to the state, and now we're currently looking to the state because of this threat of death, then there's something else that the church needs to be and say in that that I haven't heard as loudly and clearly as I could. And I like a contrarian from time to time as well.
Oh.
And so there's something in that insistence that death does not have the final word. That needs to be said and heard in whatever ways that it can be said and heard. And, if you can be... Did I tell you what I did in February before I'd really started paying attention to this? That I opened a file on my desk, and I put 5 sort of books and files on books into it, and the master file is called Cranky Old Men. And there are these sort of books, and I feel like I shouldn't actually say which books they are. They're not by any friends of ours, right? But but they're either books that I know to be a certain way or suspect to be a certain way, and started reading through a couple of them. I've told you about some of these, some of the ones that I'm reading through this, and in a certain way, I think Reno belongs in that category in a certain kind of response to this, which has an element of truth to it, but which rings pretty empty, like pointing in a certain direction, but for me is a pretty deeply unsatisfying way of responding to it, for all the for the little elements of truth that are in it. Is that
Yeah, like I think that I'm glad that Reno isn't making public policy, and I'm also glad that Alasdair MacIntyre isn't making public policy. But I think is it crucial that we pay attention to them? when
No, it's
Alasdair
not crucial.
MacIntyre,
It's helpful. Some of those, yeah.
I think it can be like Alasdair MacIntyre has written a lot. Well, he's not written a lot, but he's written some about the expert class, and the way in which we allow a magisterium which we assume to be infallible in the way perhaps someone in the 13th century believed ecclesial magisteria to be infallible, and that we assume that they are the only truths at this time and the only ones who can and should speak. And we're blinded to the fact that they speak from radically subjective perspectives, which are determined by politics and culture and ideology. Even yesterday, Robert Strang made a comment whereby he suggested that and I can't remember exactly what he said, but the recommendations in relation to masks were indexed to the province's capacity to supply the masks, and so that the quote unquote science was working in concert with public policy and the capacity to source these things. We see the fascinating debates about hydroxychloroquine in the States and elsewhere, France too, which are determined by political perspectives. Conservatives and Trump fans are convinced that this is the elixir of life, that it is the fountain of youth. It's good for what ails you. And then there are a whole host of other people, and there are medics, there are docs on both sides, there are men and women of science on both sides for whom this is snake oil. We will, without hard, concrete evidence, but simply with modeling, shut down our entire country. And yet, when we have similar evidence in favor of this or that drug, or similar evidence in favor of this or that mask or whatever, we don't implement it. Why? Because of politics. One of the biggest tragedies, now again, a lot of people have died, families are destroyed, but from my own personal perspective, one of the biggest tragedies of this is that I have lost my innocence. That I, for so long, was simply a happy, comfortable, blinkered member of the elite. That the media class, CNN, what have you, the comedic cast with Stephen Colbert, Trevor Noah, academics, we've all assumed that we were the objective ones, we were the pure ones, we were the rational ones, whereas Fox was the this ridiculous ideologically determined nonsense. I have watched pretty much all of Trump's pressers.
Have you really? 2 hours a day for the last fortnight or more?
I've certainly watched sections of almost everyone. Almost everyone. So 6 o'clock in the evening, 6:30. The Q&A parts. Parts. And therefore, I have heard what he said and how he said it. And then what newspaper am I reading? I'm reading The Guardian. And so then what he says and how he says it. And then The Guardian and CNN. And there's a complete disconnect. That The Guardian and CNN are no more objective than Fox News. And that's traumatizing to me. I'm
going to share another article for you to see here. Yeah. I think masks are the perfect example. And it was a month ago, March 17th. Did you see this piece that Zanip Tufekci wrote? She's exactly right.
That's early. Wow.
It's really
she was a voice
early.
in the wilderness on March 17th.
She was really smart about it. And it was exactly right. She said, look what's happening in Asia. They're using masks. Our authorities here are telling us they're not effective. She calls BS on that. And she says, it's a great article.
Wow,
There's 6 or 7 reasons that she goes through here.
that's prophetic.
It's exactly right, and she's exactly right that basically the authorities. It's the same thing that you said, that um, that when public policy serves basically political availability and interest and
Yeah,
capability, it undercuts itself. And
yeah,
that has happened in a number of different ways, kind of small, but the masks are the big way.
yeah,
It was only the CDC's recommendation last week, and really, there's a great kind of counter narrative that we'll throw the New York Times in with it, since that's the site of this, because Zeynep Tufekci was cutting across the main advice of the New York Times at the time,
yeah,
in March, which said, "Look, you don't need masks. Masks are not recommended when they had been in
yeah,
Singapore."
yeah,
And the narrative still remains in the major media outlets. Look, the CDC says wear a mask, and Trump says, "Well, I'm not gonna."
yeah,
That becomes the story, when in fact the story is all the sort of official information said we don't need masks just because we
yeah,
didn't have them. Seems to be the deeper analysis, or we were unwilling to
yeah.
face the fact that there was a rationale for wearing them, perhaps. And
Yeah.
anyway, there's
And
so
we
it's
and we trust those voices as part of a posture in which we enjoy being the informed, sophisticated, rational ones, poo-pooing the absurd, uneducated, irrational ones. And and that's what makes the elite, sadly us, the elite. That posture is a posture that we're comfortable in, whereas Trump and Trump supporters, like Trump is an odious, ugly, um, amoral cudgel that that sections of the US public are using to attack people like me who in some ways deserve to be attacked. We deserve to be attacked for lampooning these people, for laughing at these people, for calling these people the worst things that anyone can be called: bigot, racist, etc. And Trump is their grotesque, malformed weapon. you know. And so when he has a go at CNN, whose posture in the press conferences, you're an absolute idiot, and you're completely deranged, and I'm informed, and I'm smugly saying that you're an idiot, and he goes, screw you, in various ways, and we go, oh, proof that the man is an absolute idiot. All his supporters are going, fight the power. This is the voice we want. And so we're seeing some of that now. If someone asked me 2 months ago, could Trump be reelected, I would have, bleeding from the ears in agony at the very thought, said, of course not, it can't happen. Now, having the veil pull back and seeing what's happening, it's possible. you know and that's a traumatic thing. That's one of the reasons why I think, for example, hydroxychloroquine matters so much, that because our caste, the media, late night talk shows, like Jimmy Kimmel said that Trump has stock in hydroxychloroquine again, which is rationally the equivalent of a Fox News person saying that Obama's a Kenyan Muslim. you know?
right.
But Kimmel's our guy, and so it's okay. But if, in one sense, God forbid, in one sense, please God, hydroxychloroquine is some kind of effective therapy, Trump could be elected on the back of that. It will become a massive election issue. And so one of my biggest fears are this turn to fascism, this turn to the state, this this making countenanceable things that were not countenanceable before. That is the arresting of people who might have parties or walk in parks or do things like this. That, coupled with the possibility of 4 more years for Trump during a time of massive economic turmoil and mass unemployment, is this not meant to be called staying sane with Dave Daniel? But that's a nightmare, which to me is far worse than this slightly uncomfortable dream that we're living through now. That's a scary prospect. It really is. How do you think Trudeau's doing?
I mean, I think fine. Did you see what was he said the word,
Moistly.
what was moistly?
Yeah.
Speaking moistly, and that got turned into some sound engineer, musician in Edmonton turned it into. You saw the video of that.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. He'd been doing fine up until then.
Yeah. Yeah. And Boris was doing absolutely horrifically until he ended up in hospital, and then all of a sudden his stock went up.
Isn't that strange?
Yeah. Angela Merkel's been doing well, I think. Macron has been doing reasonably well. He's been slightly more balanced. Again, in France, you've got the exact same, well, not the exact same, but a very similar divide than you have in the States between the Parisian elites and Marseille, and all that Marseille represents. And they have managed to leverage the coronavirus issue and indeed hydroxychloroquine into this warfare. And again, they have their, in the same way in the 14th century, there might be two different clerics or two different knights. Now we've got two different professors of medicine. who are going up against it, which should at least, and I hope one of the outcomes of this will be that our faith in a monolithic thing called science will be exposed as false.
Yeah. I mean, there's who knows. Okay, so let me pull one more book out of my file of cranky old men. So there's a book that I skimmed quickly a couple of years ago because I needed to, but I didn't actually read carefully, which was called The Benedict Option. And I'm sure you know this book. It was kind of all the rage for a while, and I thought, like, I'm actually going to read it word for word, because it's sort of, for whatever reason, I felt like it. But I did it just as Corona news virus. Actually, one of the reasons I did it is because I'm blanking on the name. Who?
Rod Dreher.
Yeah, Rod Dreher, of course. Rod Dreher blogs at the American Conservative, and he was one of the very early people who saw the coronavirus as a threat. And so I saw a kind of implicit contrast between him and Reno, because Dreher was saying, "This is it. This is the apocalypse. Get yourselves ready." At the very time that Reno was, for what seemed to me like they're kind of in similar places, and yet they took opposite responses to the early days of the coronavirus issue. So that actually prompted me to go and just read the book through. Okay, so there's a way in which I think that the coronavirus has sort of activated Option Benedict. Everybody's been sent home. Everybody's been turned into a homeschooling parent if they have kids at home. And cultural issues aside, there's a certain amount of similarity, right? We're all being sort of sent in, and we're trying to, I suppose, think about what our values are, think about how to live and survive in this world in crisis. And the Dreher Option, I suppose, like other books in my file, these other 5 books, some of them seem to have a very similar narrative, right? Which is a very familiar narrative, that the Enlightenment was really bad. Thomas Aquinas is shockingly brilliant. I didn't realize that. First I was an Aristotelian. This is the Alasdair MacIntyre's progression, right? And then I realized that actually Thomas Aquinas is a genius, and that we all know people like this. There are people in Halifax who are this kind of guy. And then yeah, right. And then well, I was thinking of other people, but yeah, okay. And then the world falls apart through the Enlightenment. The Reformation gets some of the blame, but really there are other factors here, and that we hang on with a kind of an increasingly post-Christian trajectory for a while. But then, as Rod Dreher puts it in such bold terms, culture wars are basically lost in the 60s. There's a sexual revolution, and that's step one. The culture wars in the States sort of play out in a certain way, and they're lost when gay marriage loses, as he puts it, or wins in the Supreme Court, and that's the end of the game. Game over. It's time to, not retreat, but it's time to pull the drawbridges up. And if you have Christian kids, says Dreyer, if you have kids and you're a Christian, you need to pull them out of public schools. If they're in Christian schools, pull them out of Christian schools. Unless they're classical Christian schools, you need to start homeschooling, and you need to prepare for the new cold winter that is coming, and start to sort of, do that. And now we have a situation where the public policy is drawbridges up and homeschool everybody. We'll try to provide you a little bit of support.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about how I'm just curious what you think about the trajectory. I don't know. There's a whole longer conversation there, but where I really ultimately want to get is, how are you doing at home? What are the deans and what are the drivers doing at home as they try to be well-actualized people in this situation, and in fact also as Christian families in some way? What does the Christian family look like? Because you and I have no policy prerogatives so great as our prerogatives at home.
Absolutely. So one of the things, this is sort of macro point, and then I'll focus on the more local and domestic. But I was always stunned by how, after the Second World War in particular, our faith in modern Western Enlightenment was never higher. The church's faith in the West, in modernity, and all it represented was never greater. But I'm getting a sense of that now, that we do want things to go back to normal, and we do rely tremendously on the state, and it might be our only hope, and so therefore we will once again surrender everything. And so I think long term this is going to be really bad for the Benedict Option. And I also love your point about how everything is becoming more domestic. I found myself recently looking at New Brunswick projections recently and going, irrelevant. Until I get the Nova Scotia land bridge, until I get the Nova Scotia projection, these mean nothing to me. It might as well be in, on Mars. I'm finding so. And again, I know this all sounds so glib and trite, but my kids, similar ages to yours, in about 10 years, the two eldest will be at or out of college. They will certainly not be living at home, and I will be pining for the loss of an idyllic past, an idyllic misremembered past, when they never bickered, when they never fought, when there was no stress or anxiety, and they were home and all was good. And so I'm trying very much, when not driven to distraction by bickering, etc., to enjoy and appreciate this tremendous blessing that I have, that I am never more than 50 feet away from the people I love most in the world. That's just insane. I don't want to say long may it last, but it is something that I'd be a fool if I didn't embrace. Secondly, I am trying to balance the loss in curricular education, because they're working hard and they're doing well, and the school is doing well via Zoom and all the rest of it, but it's not going to be the same. But I'm trying to balance that out with other forms of education. And so I've upped the ante on theological conversation, which a lot of the time they don't want, and historical conversation. We've done some work on the U.S. War of Independence. Why the U.S. War of Independence, Revolutionary Wars? Because I know very little about it, and so I want to learn more about it. And in two, it might be broadly relevant to them on a curricular level. so we've been doing some explorations on that and reading of that, and had a couple of classes on that. their prayer life has come on. I was tremendously proud of them for being able to sit through the entire Rosary Novena. When I was my daughter's age, so we had an aged grandaunt who was at least 270 years of age, and she was cranky, and she was part of a of a of a rabidly Catholic Irish culture, which was, I'm not even sure they believed in God, but they really believed in the church and Mary. You know? There is no God, but Mary's his mother. That was their policy. And so you pray the rosary, good stuff happens to you, and Russia gets converted. That was their summa. That was basically what happens. And so we didn't say the rosary all the time, except when the grandaunt came to stay, and she moved around to all the various families, and so she would stay with us like for 2 months, and then 2 months with this family. And so for every night for these 2 months, we'd be down on our knees and saying the Rosary Novena, and it was agony for me, because it was, it was boring. I was kneeling down, my knees were sore. It was just, and my daughters are so much better at being good human beings than I was. Um, they're able to they're able to pray it in an interesting way, and they're able to, the thinking behind the rosary is that you meditate in your mind on a particular moment from the life of Mary, which enables you to perhaps see a moment in the life of Christ through the eyes almost of a mother, and to hopefully feel the sorrow, the joy, the glory, or all these things by that process of meditation, that connection, that what is you like. And then the repetition of the Hail Marys is a kind of a mantra while meditating on this. And when it works in this fashion, and it's designed to get you to see or to appreciate Christ in a very, very distinctive way. And so I hope that that's having a subtle subconscious impact on them. I really believe that it had a subtle subconscious impact on me, that even when I was kneeling there, like being pissed off, and I remember like I'd always try and say one or two Hail Marys less, in the hopes that my dad wouldn't be counting out his 10 and I'd get away with it. Like I was just a bad kid. And but I was counting along, and my kids did the full 10 in each of their decades. And so I think there's a lot of good things. We have a little badminton net out the back, and so we're able to, it's like a young horse, that you'd lunge a young horse to try and get the energy out of them. My daughter Sophia, who's 13, is unbelievably competitive. So we play badminton with her, and she's able to compete and be aggressive and stuff like that, and try and get it out that way. So this is one of the up days. This is one of the 9 up days rather than the 10 down day. And so right now I think it's going well, and I think that educationally they will fall back on a curricular level, but they will ascend in terms of their knowledge of things they currently don't know about. And I think that their spiritual lives will be consciously or subconsciously improved. And so I think we will emerge from this time, hopefully, better than when we went in. That's the hope, But again, my daughter Onia's outside. She's in her pajamas. Her hair, and you'll know this, like, it's particular for Onia because she's got a sort of light-colored hair. But no one can look more like Patsy from Absolutely Fabulous than a 6-year-old first thing in the morning. Yeah. When she comes downstairs and the hair is all over the face, and it looks like she's been out partying all night. So if anyone saw her, they'd probably call child services. But I think they're all doing well. I hope they are, and Yeah. What about you? Like you've got a good backyard. The kids are able to get out,
Yep. Yep.
but they've got that backyard that's a little bit boundaryless, and so that
It
was
is a little bit, and
yeah,
they do spill across it sometimes. You're absolutely right that we have no idea about the interior life and what they'll be, how many rosaries they skipped or tried to skip, right? Like, who knows? Who knows what the
yeah.
long-term impact of. I'll do a similar kind of structure in my answer to go from kind of a general point to some specifics, and then say, we commend all this to God and
Yeah.
see what comes. So to do that, let's see. I pulled up a couple websites. I'll do one last round of screen sharing. Okay. So this is, I was kind of struck by, let's get this up here. So the American Academy of Pediatrics set some recommendations a couple of years ago that were then picked up in Canada on children and media tips. And, they have not revised these. I checked. They haven't revised these in recent years. Limit digital media for the youngest family members. Yeah. 18 to 24 months, zero media, they recommend. Yeah. At ages 2 to 5, just 1 hour of high quality programming that you at best case, you sit down and review with them. So in a certain sense, the state, and these are almost exactly what were developed in Canada. There's a sort of a history to this where, where is it here? There we go. Canadian Pediatric Society developed basically the same recommendations. It doesn't matter. And in a certain sense, I would say in the big picture, it's sort of like the thing about death, where the state and the church can agree that death is bad. And then when you extend that a little bit, disagreement starts to enter. And in fact, that agreement stretches almost to a breaking point in certain circumstances. Is it the only good? Well, no. Is it the ultimate good? Well, no. And in fact, living within the reality of Easter pushes some different answers upon us than simply like preserve life at all costs. Right. So there is a kind of that primer that we saw from Jacobs that death is bad. It's good to have that reminder, and yet there's a but that needs to be described there. So in a similar sort of way, if the state can tell us limit the screen time, but it doesn't tell us how to fill that time, and there's a way in which all people, but if we're thinking about the church, specifically Christian people, need to think carefully about how they fill that time. And all of us are now struggling to do that in whatever circumstances we're in. Yeah. My wife is a real hero in that she had already sort of imposed upon us an even song, or basically a compline that we'd been doing for a little while, for 12 months. And that became one of the pillars. And instead of just doing a single half sheet in Lent, we pushed that up to a front and back sheet. And, so there's sentences. And by the end of it, here, I can pull that up too, actually. By the end of that, my 9-year-old had it memorized cold. I mean, all of our kids basically had it memorized.
That's fantastic.
And so in the morning, I made everybody get up and get dressed. And, for the last month, start with breakfast. And we've been doing... I kind of go to the things that I know. My contribution to the curriculum has been half an hour of Hebrew in the morning, and then later half an hour of classics. I've been reading Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey to the oldest.
Fantastic.
It's wonderful. And then, before we go to bed, we do evensong or compline together. And let me pull this up one more time here. So we had this order for Lent, and I was astonished on Saturday. I hadn't really noticed, but my 9-year-old was leading it, and she didn't look at her sheet but once. Wow. She just sort of had this, and so we've been singing the Psalms. There is a... Let me pull up the new one from Easter. And what Adria would always say about this is there's the kind of mommy blogs, and she doesn't like to post on Facebook because it makes, we all select for the most beautiful things in our life without being honest about how terrible lots of things are. That is definitely the case. Yeah. But one of the most successful sort of pillars in all of this has been some reading, some math, and then sort of common prayer at the end of the day. And this is set up for the double sheet printing. But
Fantastic.
there's a Toronto-based, actually, I think it was from, I don't know his biography, but an organist. Where did it go? This is the new order for Easter. I pulled up the wrong thing. Yeah, let me give the last piece. George Black has sung the Psalms. So anyway, we've been doing that, singing
Hmm.
things, singing the Nunc Dimittis, and that's been fine. And so I think that's one of those things that will just get kind of layered in there for our girls, whether they like it or not. They will
Yeah.
never not remember that as long as they're,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not trendy, but that's the kind of stuff that whatever part of the brain it goes into, it stays generative, all your life.
yeah,
Like even I think back to, we learn by rote. We learn poetry, by rote in schools. Our teachers weren't the best, and so they would give us a massive poem and learn 8 lines for tomorrow, learn 8 lines for the next day. They'd never interpret these poems. We should have to learn them off, but they're still in there. And regularly a little snippet of poetry comes at particular times when you're interpreting something or experiencing something, and it's there along with you. You didn't enjoy it at the time, you didn't welcome it, you didn't want it, you didn't know what it was doing, but it somehow got into some part of the brain and just stayed producing all your life. And so, I hope that during this time, the kids can benefit, like those beautiful words from Compline, they're
it's pretty
there.
good stuff. I
You
mean,
know,
it's pretty solid. The
yeah,
I think the if there's a title for this era for me so far, it's like art and learning amidst squabbles, because all of us are just on a short
yeah,
fuse. All
yeah,
of us sort of erupt at different points. I was actually last night pulling together the Easter update for that liturgy and literally swearing while I was doing
yeah,
it
yeah,
because I
yeah,
was
yeah,
out of time and I was out of
yeah.
patience and I was trying to
Oh,
dash it off. And, so it's not a beautiful scene. But in a certain sense, I think we've been living a little bit like my idea of artists. Now, I actually happen to know an artist who seems to have a very tranquil life,
mhm.
and is sheltering with his family elsewhere in Halifax and doing very well. But my idea of an artist is somebody who lives in emotional turmoil and kind of
Yeah,
physical squalor. And I feel like that's creeping in. And yet, out of that, there are certain prayers and certain projects,
yeah,
a lot of art's being produced. And that gives me a kind of hope that there's that something out of this very strange time. We haven't even talked about the tragedy yet, right? There's for me this bigger sense of doom that we don't know whose names we'll know. We don't know whose lives will be lost in this period. But as we wait for those things to kind of crash in around us,
yeah.
there's some work to be done. That's not that kind of just be productive for productivity's sake,
Yes, yes,
but
yes,
that
yes.
can be kind of touching base with these things where we kind of try to layer in some of the good
Yeah,
into what I find to be pretty challenging circumstances.
yeah. Well, let's do another one of these when things get more intense, and we can focus more on the what Trump keeps loves calling the scourge. he just he loves using that term, and we'll see how we're doing. But yeah, I think I am sure that lots of good things are going to come from this too. Like alongside the horror, and it's a horror that's unfairly and unequally distributed. It's we're very very lucky. We're blessed. Um, we're not suffering anything like the way other people are, and so I'm very much aware of this, and so I don't want to sound glib or twee about this, but
So let's touch base on that in a little bit, but just so we kind of mark the time, what's the kind of closest that it's come to you at a personal level? The yeah, the not close or
it
close.
hasn't. Yeah, I don't know anyone who. I don't personally. I don't know anyone who has it. I don't know anyone who's died personally. I'm sure all that will change, probably. But yeah, we've been just very, very sheltered. What about you?
Similar. Two pieces that I put in. We missed a funeral it would have been in Oregon. My grandpa died in February, and there was just no getting out for the funeral. By the time people got organized for that, and of course that's a common story. But you're right. Some of the the protections that are there in comfortable and wealthy countries like Canada and the United States aren't there in lots of other places. My brother has run a restaurant in southern Chile. And I spoke to him a week ago, and he said he's got $220, 2 mortgages on 2 different restaurants, laid off 41 employees. He's got all these assets. He's got 3 kitchens and a couple of trucks and equipment to make beer. But so he's in a spot where what the government said was, all right, you can draw down on your retirement, your government pensions if you want some help right now, and we'll permit you to do that. And if it gets worse, check back in with us, and we'll read the Panama Papers and see where we left that stuff. So all of that is distant in a certain sense, but I do have this sense like it's coming closer in a way, and the way that we count our own personal tragedy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that will have an impact on every single person we know.
Wow.
Yeah. So we'll see.
Wow. Yeah, but that's again a reminder at once of the horror of this thing, and then also a reminder of how fortunate we are. Although comically, I'm finding it hard to get paid these days. For and I think I wonder. So I've done a few different things, talks and presentations and workshops and stuff like that, and I can see people going, should we send David Dean that EMT, and someone going, let's give it a few weeks. let's just see how he does in all this, but yeah, it's at that comical level of nothing that is the level of burden we've been affected by. But we'll see how things go. Me in my Panglossian idiocy, I'm not sure that I can't imagine Nova Scotia is going to be Northern Italy or anything like it. I think we'll be modestly hit, and it will be tragic, and it'll be painful, and it'll be terrible. But Dr. Strang the other day said we shouldn't drive unless it's absolutely essential, because we want to keep the roads free for ambulances and paramedics and stuff like that. And I'm going, maybe it'll get to that stage, but it's not at that stage now. There's not ambulances going right and left. God willing, it won't get to that stage. It might, and we'll check back in then and see how our sanity is doing. Daniel, thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate it greatly, and thanks for sharing and for your thoughts and for your wisdom. And thank you, listeners, and maybe even a couple of viewers for spending this time with us. And please do leave your thoughts and comments and any advice you have for staying sane during this very, very strange time below. So from me, David Dean, and our wonderful co-host today, Daniel Driver, thanks for your time.